Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and I am welcomed by Eric Trexler today. So if you don't know Eric, he has a PhD and has published over 30 papers of research. So you guys know that he's incredibly smart and well-read and, helping further the research. He's a coach himself with loads of experience in kind of helping people lose fat, gain muscle, a natural bodybuilder, has dabbled in powerlifting, and he is the new director of education at Stronger by Science. So for those who don't know, that is Greg Nichols' kind of company. So that's really cool. And yeah, if there's anything you want to kind of expand upon there, please do, Eric. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think you summed it up well. I'm a bodybuilder at heart that got into science, and now I do both.
Which is really cool because a lot of our listeners we're kind of geeks, but also love to lift. And you're one who does exactly both. You're researching and have competed. And something I said that I wanted to ask Eric off air was talking about kind of why is bodybuilding research so hard to do? I think a lot of our listeners, myself included, sometimes get frustrated because we kind of, a study looks really cool and then you look at who's kind of involved, you're like, that isn't so applicable maybe. So I'd love to hear from a researcher, why is it so difficult to get good bodybuilding research?
Yeah, I mean, that's, one of the things about bodybuilding research is that they're the projects I did that I'm most proud of and had the most fun with, but were also the biggest headaches. They're very difficult to make them work. And there's two main reasons. The first one is fairly obvious, which is research costs money. We have to, anytime you want to measure anything important, it requires equipment. And sometimes, anything hormone related, that's money that you can't just buy a piece of equipment and use it for decades. It's like you buy the reagents to do the assay, you get one shot and those reagents are used. So it costs money to take measurements, and the more essentially fancy or sophisticated the measurements, the cooler questions you can answer, but usually the more cost is involved. So that's why, if you want to do something and your only measurement is bench press, well, that's a one-time cost that you can use for decades. But when you want to start getting into hormones, when you want to start getting into more complex measurements, there's a lot more money involved. And, the question is, where does that money come from? It's basically two sources. Private entities or government organizations are really the places where you often get research funding. There aren't a lot of private entities that have a vested interest in funding bodybuilding research, So a lot of the other research I've done is on supplements, and that's a very obvious marriage in which, supplement companies need research done on their products. And, researchers like us, we can very easily say, well, we want to run this study. It's on something that's relevant to you. Will you offer funding for it? Or it can work the other way, where a company says, we need this research done. Do you have the capacity to do it? So in that case, there's there's an obvious pairing where there's someone with a financial interest and somebody with the capacity to actually do the work. With bodybuilding, there's no one entity that says, hey, we want to push the general premise of bodybuilding. Here's some money to do a study. So that's the obvious one. And then, with government entities and healthcare related entities, there's just not a huge public interest in how to get someone from 11% body fat to 5 and then back to 11. Just they don't care. And I would argue, in fact, they probably shouldn't. If the question is like, hey, there's some grant money on the table, we're either going to research cardiovascular disease or cancer or bodybuilding, I'd say leave it to the other two guys. We'll find a different way. I don't want to steal from that pot of money. So funding is tough. The logistics are extremely tough. That's kind of part two of it. So a great example of that is we did our study on post-competition, kind of what happens after competition. And what you run into there is that, we can't just show up at a competition, take some measurements and say, everybody come back in a certain number of months. Because what you'll find is some people in that show have traveled in from quite some distance and do not want to come back. What you'll also find is some of those people have another show in 3 weeks. So if we're trying to look at post-competition recovery, they are not doing that. So you have to restrict things and say, well, it's got to be local competitors and it's got to be people that this is their final show of the year and they won't, basically commit to not doing another one for at least like 6 or 12 months, all of a sudden that big show with a bunch of competitors yields a very small pool of potential participants. So that's really tricky on even just looking at after the show. When it comes to studying what people are doing into the competition, now you're asking a bodybuilder to let some random person in a lab coat dictate every aspect of their competition prep. And frankly, for most bodybuilders, choosing how to prep and manipulating variables as you go is the entire fun. Mm-hmm. It's not just, hey, here's a template. You're going to feel very tired and hungry for a few months. That's not a very fun thing. The fun thing is, how do I do this and try to get the right combination of factors to maximize my look, to minimize my side effects. And basically every time you do it, you're trying to get it more correct, mm-hmm. and continually improve your approach. If you were to just hand that over to some person who's going to randomly give you one of two plans, that honestly takes a lot of fun out for the competitors. And more pragmatically, or more applicable to your question, no one's willing to do that. Yeah. So even if it wasn't a huge hit on how much they would enjoy it, it's just, you're not going to get anyone to do that. So, the research we did during my PhD was mostly observational. You can work with case studies, in which, that's a very nice way to do it, where you can still get some cool measurements done and still let a person operate freely with how they prep, but you basically can get a very comprehensive view of exactly how they managed all those variables. The post-competition study I mentioned, we collected the data in Tampa. I did not intend to collect the data in Tampa. Logistically, it was the only way to make it work. Wow. I was in Chapel Hill trying to do the recruitment process, and very, very quickly realized Chapel Hill is not the place to do this study. And we were very fortunate that Bill Campbell is a good friend of mine and a good friend of my advisors. And we said, okay, Tampa, for whatever reason, is actually quite a hotbed of physique athletes. So we were able to basically fly down there and make it happen, which was, again, not the plan, but logistically kind of the only way to make it work.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. I mean, just for the fact is, I don't think people often think about, okay, research costs money. There's lots of money involved within it. And if anything, money is going to go towards things that are much more important within our health, longevity, like obesity research. Like, there's loads of things on that because it's important. So I absolutely respect that. And then, finding participants just in my head, I was thinking, would I even commit to that? It's like, I just know I wouldn't. It's kind of like I wouldn't let an app dictate what I was doing during my contest prep. I couldn't leave it to an app. I'd need someone to be able to talk to and converse with. And bodybuilders are probably some of the hardest people to ever convince to do something, especially if they've got their own ways, which most of us do. And I wonder, I think something I find really valuable is, like, on this podcast, I can talk to people like yourself who are coaches and they coach people. And then you just find out a lot through their experience, because oftentimes they've just had so many protocols with so many different clients. It's almost more valuable sometimes than trying to rely on the small amount of research we have. Do you often see that yourself?
Yeah, I think anytime you're interacting with somebody that's actively doing it, whether it's, your own prep or somebody else's prep, you still see things that surprise you, and then you kind of try to make sense of it. You rely on literature, you rely on experience, you try to triangulate all that information. But yeah, a lot of times I will talk to people like, Lane Norton and Eric Helms, and, we'll be like, we're looking at a case study that we just did, and I'll be like, does this make any sense to you? Because you've, as a prep coach, you've basically run a few hundred case studies. Yeah. You might not have had access to the measurements, but you've been there and you've seen the pretty obvious things happening as they come. And so I think that's one of the things that was most rewarding for me with doing some of the case studies is we've always kind of known that some of this stuff is happening, but we've never had numbers to back it up. We've never had the capacity to actually measure the things that we are making inferences about. So, you can have a client that says, let's say you're working with a natural male competitor, and they're like, man, I feel really lethargic and have no libido. That's something we've known for ages, but until people started doing case studies on it, we haven't been able to say, here's the magnitude of drop off in thyroid hormones and testosterone. Here's how rapidly they occur in the process, and here's how long it takes for them to recover. Until we start getting measurements, then it's just a lot of guesswork and trying to figure out, especially like my most recent prep, I had a lot of issues trying to get sleep. Hunger actually wasn't an issue in terms of like subjective hunger, but sleep was just very difficult to come by. And so you run into a situation where until you start taking measurements on things, it's hard to approximate, for someone who's late in prep, hey, I feel lethargic and crappy and have no libido. And you start to think, well, how much of that could be overtraining related? How much could be undersleeping, underfeeding, thyroid hormone, testosterone? Until we start getting some of these measurements put down to paper, it's a lot of guesswork because these different factors have overlapping realms and how they could kind of subjectively feel to the athlete.
Yeah, I think the research, I wouldn't have liked to have, I hope it didn't sound like I was saying the research isn't valuable, because I absolutely think it's very valuable, like you just said there, because it actually allows you to have expectations as a coach, as a client, to whether or not these things are normal, or if they're kind of potentially you're feeling these things way sooner than you necessarily should, or it just allows you to have expectations so that post-show you can be like, right, I don't know, I'm a couple of months post-show, should I be feeling kind of normal yet? And it's like, well, we actually have this data we can go by and kind of give inferences towards that. And as a coach and client, like, it's super valuable. And one of the studies I wanted to go over with you was the study on metabolic adaptation to weight loss and the implications for the athlete. So in other words, kind of what happens when we get people from lean to really lean. And I'd love to kind of first of all go over what changes kind of occur step by step. So kind of the adaptive thermogenesis, increased mitochondrial efficiency, hormonal alterations, like each of those segments, and then maybe we can kind of attack how can we best kind of alleviate them or make them as small as possible. So yeah, if we go over the initial, what happens when we go from lean to really lean?
Yeah, definitely. And if I start rambling and fail to answer the question or a part of it, just interject, keep me on track. And I do want to reiterate, a lot of times there's, like you mentioned, you weren't trying to downplay the aspect of research. And I like to live in both of those worlds. Yeah. And I view them as two completely equal contributors to helping us understand, when we go into planning a study in a physique athlete, where do you think we get our hypotheses or like our intended plan of what we're going to measure? In that case, those research questions start at the coach level and the client level and work their way to research, So I really dislike when people that have some of that lab access or lab experience act like observations in the field aren't helpful, especially in something like this field of study. They are really what forms the basis for those research questions. So yeah, I've never understood the practitioners who don't care what researchers have to say, and I've never understood the researchers who refuse to listen to the practitioners. It makes absolutely no sense to me. But yeah, so getting into your question, metabolic adaptation, it was really like the first big project I took on as a graduate student. Got a lot of help from Lane Norton on that, who's I've always loved Lane. He's been tremendously helpful to me my entire career. But basically the premise was, you've someone like Lane who's worked with hundreds of clients and made a lot of, non-academic observations that are academic in nature. So I'm trying to look at this objectively. Here's what I'm seeing. How do we make sense of this? And the kind of repeated observation is we get people down into contest shape and, all those generic calculators of here's your deficit, here's your expected weight loss. They're not really matching up to what we're seeing. And so the question is, it seems like these athletes are getting more energetically efficient as we go through the weight loss process and approach very low body fat levels and have relatively large energy deficits. And so the question is, what do we make of that and what could potentially be at play there? Because if a certain observation comes up enough times and you are actively trying to be objective about it, at a certain point you have to say, it's time to start actually making some sense of this and putting together some evidence that would kind of help to explain it. And so there's kind of a two-pronged approach, really. At first, you review the evidence available, and then you generate new evidence, right? Like that's kind of the research process. So first we wrote that review paper, and then we did some studies on physique athletes to actually start measuring stuff. So the review paper talks about what happens when it comes to, metabolic rate, mitochondrial efficiency, and hormonal changes. And the reason it was a little bit difficult to structure the paper, and I'm working on a really long article right now for Stronger by Science on this topic, the concepts are all interrelated. Mm-hmm. So if we start big picture, what we know with contest prep is resting metabolic rate is going to go down as you lose lean tissue throughout a contest prep, or just total tissue even. But what we see looking at the literature, both in bodybuilders and in just obese individuals losing weight, is the reduction in resting metabolic rate is more than we would have expected. It's not simply the loss of tissue, because when we try to correct for that, there's still a deficit there. There's still kind of a mismatch. So we know that resting metabolic rate should fall with weight loss in general, but it's also falling more than it would be expected to. So that's resting metabolic rate. Exercise activity thermogenesis, the calories we burn during exercise, also seem to fall a little bit more than we would expect. Certainly, you would expect if you're, think of something like running or a locomotive exercise, you are moving a smaller mass, your body weighs less. So we would expect some change in efficiency, but even when we correct for that, there's still, again, a mismatch. And the big, really, the most influential factor is non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So again, we might expect that would fall with weight loss in general, but what we see is that it is a very pronounced fall when it comes to non-exercise activity. So the final part of energy expenditure is the thermic effect of feeding. In the interest of a comprehensive rundown, that's going to fall with weight loss because you're going to be eating less. But in terms of, any unexpected drop or a relative increase in efficiency, we really don't see much for thermic effect of feeding. That aspect is pretty straightforward. You eat less, so it takes less calories to digest and absorb stuff. But the other three components are changed at a relative level. They drop more than we would expect. And the real huge contributor is non-exercise activity. So that's the calories you burn doing any kind of activity that is not structured exercise. And if you've been around athletes, if you coach them, if you've done a prep, that's pretty clear, right? Mm-hmm. It's like one of those things, like the kind of joke is like when you're in prep and like the room that you're sitting in catches on fire, you just kind of look over and you're like, do I really think that fire is going to spread, or can I just stay here? Like it's just, if it's not an absolute dire emergency, you just stop moving. Like it's crazy. It like late in prep. And then even just subconscious things like fidgeting in your chair. Like what we see is that those non-essential physical activity tasks are extremely constrained in contest prep. So those are the aspects of energy expenditure that change, and cumulatively altogether, they leave us in a spot where we thought we would be losing more weight than we are at a given caloric intake and a given level of physical exercise. Now that's where some of these other factors come into play. With non-exercise activity, there's certainly behavioral things that we can look at and say, well, that explains it. You've subconsciously constrained your non-exercise activity, and probably the key center that's really dictating that is the hypothalamus, in my opinion. There's certainly conscious regulation, but there's also subconscious regulation. Mm-hmm. And the hypothalamus is really the key integrator when it comes to brain structures of energy availability and what we choose to do with that in terms of hunger, activity levels, movement. The hypothalamus really triangulates all of the feedback that's coming back as the primary integration center for that information. this is where things like the hormone response and mitochondrial efficiency come into play. And mitochondrial efficiency, just to give a general idea of what we're talking about there, if you took, 8th grade biology or high school biology, they'll call mitochondria the powerhouses of the cell. Mm-hmm. And that's because a huge proportion of our daily ATP is made there. Very, very huge proportion. And so ATP, again, from high school biology, is the energy currency of the cell. If we want to do things that take biological energy, those biological processes are going to require ATP. So the mitochondria have to make it. Without giving an exhaustive kind of run through macronutrient metabolism, we're going to burn off the macronutrients we have, whether it's through food or stored macronutrients. So the food we eat, the fat that we have stored, glycogen, we're going to burn those and make ATP in the process. And that's heavily reliant on how the mitochondria function. But what we see is that with caloric restriction, the mitochondria change the efficiency with which they complete those transactions. And so what we'll see is for, a given amount of caloric expenditure, they will actually create more ATP. Or probably a more appropriate way to look at that with weight loss is they can make the amount of ATP needed using less caloric expenditure. So that's probably the more notable way to, or the more applicable way to look at it, because your body's not going to just generate a bunch of extra ATP depending on your caloric intake. What it's going to do, ATP demand is driving all those reactions. And what your body will do is basically learn to make the same amount of ATP using less energy. So you're basically saving calories. And when I say learn to, that's obviously, it's not, a brain thing going on there. What's happening is the mitochondrial inner membrane, the characteristics of how it transports protons, it changes. And what we find is that its permeability is essentially reduced. So the way we make that ATP is we burn energy, we pump protons out. They need to get back into the inner part of the mitochondrion. And the way they do that is through the ATP synthase enzyme. And what happens is we make ATP in the process. Under normal circumstances, some of those protons are going to leak back in through other avenues. They're not going to go through that enzyme that actually produces ATP. So it's just kind of an inefficiency that is part of the process for us. But what we find is there's all sorts of rodent studies and human studies to kind of verify. But we see that the activity of some of the channels through which those protons leak are suppressed during energy restriction. So the mitochondria, to kind of summarize it, they alter the way they handle that transport of protons in a way that makes it a more efficient process so that your body, which believes it is starving, can basically get away with using less calories. So the other side of that coin, or the other kind of contributing factor, is certainly going to be hormonal changes. And that's been a focal point of a lot of our work that we've done in the lab, because hormones they cost a little bit of money to measure, but it's nowhere near the invasive and sophisticated lab techniques of looking specifically at mitochondrial function, for instance. No matter how much money you give me, I don't know how to do that, but hormones we can work with. So some of the obvious hormones that change are related to energy expenditure and hunger. So thyroid hormone pretty consistently drops during prep. Leptin pretty consistently drops. Ghrelin pretty consistently increases. So what we find is a hormonal situation where these are all feeding back to kind of indicate to the body that there's a general deficiency of energy. And so what happens is, with thyroid hormone and leptin, those are going to have huge impacts on our energy expenditure. So as they drop, our energy expenditure is certainly expected to decrease. Ghrelin is kind of a lesser known hormone, but it's heavily tied in with hunger. And so as ghrelin levels increase over the course of contest prep or general energy restriction, that's associated with an increased drive to eat. And again, leptin and ghrelin kind of have opposite functions. So when leptin falls, it not only influences your energy expenditure, but also your feeling of fullness or satiety. So I'm happy to go into more detail on any of those individual factors, but certainly we see a hormonal kind of milieu in the body in which hunger is increased, energy expenditure is suppressed, and then there are the other hormones. We'll see that testosterone and estrogen tend to drop, cortisol tends to increase. And so aside from the hunger, aside from the energy expenditure, now we have hormonal alterations that are threatening the capacity to maintain lean mass, and also causing some reproductive side effects. So for men, reduced libido is extremely common as testosterone falls. For females, we see that, or for women, we see that amenorrhea or general disruptions in the menstrual cycle are quite prevalent late in contest prep.
Mm-hmm. No, super interesting, especially it's funny bringing back kind of the eighth grade biology, or for me that was kind of like, I guess, like sixth form or something, biology classes, because it all comes flooding back, and it's very interesting. And it always surprises me how incredible the body is at survival, with all these mechanisms to try and just be more efficient. Like all these things really are setting us up, and they're positive things. But for contest prep, they're awfully annoying. And you kind of spoke about kind of, we get more efficient, the body gets kind of more hunger, and it decreases the number of calories it's burning via these mechanisms. And we don't have a lot of control over those kind of inherently. Have you found any kind of particular pertinent strategies to try and reduce those side effects?
So that's quite an active area right now. I know a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, there was a paper that came out by, I think the lead author was Payos, with Lane Norton contributed. I think Eric Helms contributed, Andy Galpin. But they were looking at one of the most interesting strategies that's emerging right now, which is the idea of using intermittent energy restriction rather than just a straight kind of energy restriction. So the terminology that bodybuilders would most associate that with would be things like refeeds or diet breaks. I think that when it specifically comes to the alterations in metabolic rate and some of these hormone fluctuations, it's important to realize that some of the effect is dictated by getting really lean. Some of the effect is dictated by the acute lack of energy available. So there's kind of long-term energy restriction, but we can also look at some of the short-term manipulation of how much energy is available to the body. So these intermittent strategies are basically trying to say, well, we could basically offset some of those acute effects for a very short term, and accept the fact that, generally speaking, that some of those long-term things are going to be there, just as a natural consequence of getting lean. And I like the way you kind of brought that up, is from an evolutionary perspective. We're all searching for, what's the purpose of my life? Well, from biology is pretty simple. Like, your purpose is to not starve to death, not die of thirst, and try to reproduce. Like, that's pretty much how biological organisms work. So you kind of have to accept that we're fighting against one of our most basic needs as an organism. So the long-term stuff, there's not a ton we can do, but we can do little short-term things to at least attenuate the magnitude of those effects. Right. So the intermittent restriction, I think it's a promising avenue that people are looking at. There is evidence in humans showing that there's some benefit there. So looking at like a single day overfeeding, I don't think one day, based on the evidence that's out there, is really enough to put a dent in it. Bill Campbell did a couple studies where so far they've only been put out as abstracts. But a 2-day refeeding period was starting to look like, okay, over the long term, maybe a little more favorable for lean mass retention, maybe a little more favorable for keeping energy expenditure closer to where it should be. There's also some studies looking at 3 days and beyond. And I think 3 days and beyond is kind of, if you're really trying to put a dent in some of those metabolic adaptations, I think that is probably where you should be focusing your energy. The most one of the more extreme approaches that has really good evidence supporting it so far is kind of a 2-week on, 2-week off strategy. So there was a big study, it was called like the Matador trial.
Right.
And they did 2 weeks of energy restriction and then 2 weeks at maintenance. And it's really important to note that's maintenance. That's not back to normal, so literally the exact amount of calories to put you at a spot to maintain your new reduced body weight. So they did 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And what they found was a little bit more effective for fat loss in the long run. And they also found that it was effective at attenuating some of those unexpected drops in energy expenditure. Nice. Now, the energy expenditure did drop because we're becoming a smaller human being. So that's going to happen. But what we're trying to attenuate is those extra drops that appear to be related to energy availability, related to some of these hormonal changes. So the 2-week on, 2-week off trial, it still needs to be replicated. We still need more research to kind of say, well, what if we did 1 week, like a 2-to-1 ratio? There's still going to be some processes, additional work needed to figure out exactly what the sweet spot is. But for now, somewhere between 3 and 14 days, which is, an incredibly broad window, but that's where we're at. Mm-hmm. Now, the obvious downside there is now you're looking at a prep that is about twice as long. Yeah. So that's kind of a hard sell. But I think what most people are probably going to do with that information, and probably what I think is the easiest course moving forward, you might get that rare client that says, yeah, prep me for a year. And if you've got a year to work with, fine. You can do 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. There's going to be more guesswork. You can't do what they did for the trial and actually measure their metabolic rate and kind of keep adjusting it as you go. But that's certainly a viable option. I think most people are probably going to meet in the middle, and they'll probably say, okay, we've done about 3 weeks of good, fairly linear weight loss. Why don't we pause for a week? Something along those lines. Or they might try to get more, look at more of a microcycle than a mesocycle, to borrow from, the periodization literature. But instead of doing like a few weeks of dieting and then a week-long break, they might say, well, why don't we do 4 lower days and 3 higher days within a week in terms of kind of cycling calories, which is not super different from, when carb cycling was really big. And some people would allow their caloric intake to cycle with the carbohydrate. So, nothing in this world is new. These are things people have been doing for a while. But the more that I look at studies coming out, I think using that intermittent kind of nonlinear approach seems to be the most evidence-backed way to deal with it currently. And I think that stringing at least 2 or 3 days of higher intakes in a row is probably the ideal way to do it. Now, there's also some general best practices that you can use. When we talk about metabolic adaptation, we look at all the facets in kind of a vacuum. How do I deal with the leptin thing? How do I deal with the insulin drop that I would expect? But realistically, we're looking at broad habits that affect pretty broad outcomes. I need to keep my energy expenditure up. I need to keep my muscle, and I need to get lean. So I think looking at some more broad recommendations that might help with some of the unintended consequences of diet, certainly protein is a must. We have to keep our protein high during prep. And Eric Helms has a great review paper suggesting not only we still need it high during prep, but we might especially need it high during prep. And I think he presents a very evidence-based, very well thought out argument in that regard. So when you're prepping, looking at your macronutrient ratios is important for dealing with some of the, even if it's not doing anything for your mitochondria, we're still worried about those hormonal effects and how they're going to affect lean mass. And certainly if we're losing lean mass during prep, regardless of how we feel, we are not accomplishing what we're setting out to do. We know it'll happen to some extent, but we have to attenuate that. So high protein during the diet. When it comes to fat, that's tricky because a lot of people say, well, you should go high fat to deal with some of the testosterone effects that we see during prep. I think to some extent, there's evidence to support, there's a lot of studies where they keep everything else pretty much evenly matched and just kind of cut out fat from the diet. And that, generally speaking, has a negative effect on testosterone levels. The problem is, again, looking at short-term versus long-term dictators of these effects. I would argue that do whatever you want with your dietary fat. If you get down as a male to 5% body fat, or you're a female and you're getting down to like 10, 11% body fat, there's not enough fat in the world, at that level of calories that's going to rescue you, especially if you're a dude at 5% body fat. Unless you were born that way, your testosterone is probably going to drop off to some extent. So I would say you want to keep it as high as you can get away with. Well, I wouldn't even say that. I would say you want to prevent yourself from going below a like absolute lower limit, so that you're at least trying to do your part to keep some fat in there. And even if it's not helping with testosterone, you still need fat in the diet. Yeah. There are essential fatty acids you need, and it's going to be required for proper absorption of fat soluble vitamins. So for me, I don't like to go below 0.6 grams per kilogram of body mass. So when I'm late in prep, that's usually about 40, 45 grams of fat a day. I've noticed when I go below that, I generally don't like the outcome. And then, so you've got your protein needs met, you've got your kind of baseline fat level that you're inevitably going to reach late in prep. And then everything else comes from carbs. Will that help with leptin? Will it help with insulin? Maybe a little bit. Will it help with training? Most likely. So again, there's certain things that are just general best practices that may help a little bit with some of these things. They certainly won't be hindering those aspects. And as a general best practice, they make sense when you consider how are we going to not only deal with metabolic adaptation, but also preserve lean mass, preserve our capacity to train. So I think those are some good things to work in there. And the final thing I'll touch on is aerobic exercise, or basically in the bodybuilding world, we call it cardio. I think cardio needs to be pretty carefully managed. I wouldn't say that it's, the energy deficit and the loss of tissue is what's really pushing these metabolic adaptations forward. And certainly any aerobic exercise that contributes to an energy deficit is going to be partially responsible for those things. The reason that I encourage people to get very, very thoughtful about how they're using cardio in prep is that there is potential, if we push it too far, that it can exacerbate some of these prep-related problems. So, if we absolutely train ourselves into the dirt with a bunch of cardio, certainly that has the capacity to further alter that cortisol to testosterone ratio, which is something that we don't want. It has the ability to impair our recovery from our resistance training workouts, which certainly we don't want. And it also has the capacity, when you're talking about very high cardio amounts, to have a pretty tangible interference effect. The research on the interference effect, every now and then there's a paper that comes out saying, yeah, it doesn't look like it's that prevalent of an issue in our study, but it's very contextual. And you see that the likelihood of your cardio interfering with your strength and your hypertrophy related outcomes is increased when you start to push both of them upward. So when your total amount of training gets really high, that's where the interference effect gets pretty notable. And I would speculate that when you're also not eating enough, losing a ton of weight, training like crazy with your weights, doing a ton of cardio, pushing that cardio up is probably contributing to some of these prep-related side effects that are quite common. So those are kind of general best practices. Some of them are to directly kind of combat these, key aspects of metabolic adaptation. And some of them, it might just be a helpful bonus that they have the capacity to help in that regard.
I thought that was really well explained. And I think the research over the last, I don't know how many years now, kind of 3-4 years on refeeding has been really interesting. And then kind of talking about multiple day refeeding, because I think kind of single day refeeding was very popular for a short time, and now it's becoming more and more popular to kind of pile them together. And then like having a week off, kind of the diet break, is something I've definitely started utilizing in my coaching, kind of going further away from there. And I really liked how you put it in that we can do these things, but you're not going to completely stop the adaptations occurring. They're still, if you're going to go down to those lean levels of body fat, you're still going to see some adaptations. And I really like the discussion of, so are we going to go for like a really long prep, or are we going to like try and find this sweet spot in the middle where we can have a reasonable size prep that's not super inefficient in terms of time scale in our whole bodybuilding career, versus kind of having a really short one that we just see so many adaptations that we don't get the result we want. And I definitely agree that I see this kind of convergence happening.
Yeah, I really like that you put it that way. Sorry to interject, but I didn't want to forget to say this. I really like that you put it that way, because a lot of people there's a growing trend of, longer preps. Back in the day when I first got interested in bodybuilding, it seemed like everybody was doing a 12-week prep. Yeah. Like it didn't matter if you were like 70 pounds over stage weight or like 6 pounds over stage weight. It was, here's your 12-week prep. The preps are getting longer, and that's a good thing. But at some point, you also have to draw a line, and you have to say, listen, we call this sport bodybuilding, right? So how much of my career do I want to spend in a deficit not building muscle? And especially early in your career, do you really want to spend all that time that you could have been continuing to build up a frame of muscularity, where it's like you're just doing prep after prep and they're getting longer and longer and longer? And, you start to subconsciously turn the sport into, chronic dieting rather than bodybuilding. So while I think it's a good trend, I also think, certainly if you said, hey, 36 weeks or 12, I'd say 36. But the question is, when you start saying, well, I'm going to do 2 on 2 off for the rest of my life and just kind of prep into perpetuity, that's where it's like, okay, well, maybe we shouldn't prep for like 18 months. You know what I mean? Like there's a fine line where you want to give yourself an ability to have a discrete period that is your contest prep, and then a discrete period where it's like, okay, time to get back to recovering and then actually building some muscle.
Mm-hmm. No, brilliant. And I really like actually that you brought up talking about training age, or even just how old you are, in that once you are towards kind of the further end of your career, potentially these longer preps almost make sense, because the bodybuilding stuff kind of has almost ended because you can't build that much anymore. So I think that was a really good kind of context you provided to kind of further that discussion. And then in terms of, I definitely agree, and I think all the listeners agree, kind of, I think it's great that more people are becoming more aware of kind of the importance of having maybe slightly higher protein, prioritizing some carbohydrates there, but remembering that we need those essential fats. And something I think you talked about in the paper that I wanted to bring up as well was kind of the size of the deficit, and kind of using that kind of stepwise approach was another way you brought about kind of attenuating these things. Because I think some people like dive in and they just bomb it, or they actually, the frustrating thing I sometimes see is people go way too slow at the start, and then they end up pushing it too quickly or quicker than what would be appropriate towards the end. So I'd love you to kind of discuss that final way of attenuating some things.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I forgot to mention that.
That's all good.
That's good. The reason I forgot to mention it is because I think subconsciously I kind of lump that together with this new idea of the intermittent approach and taking diet breaks. So looking at the long-term kind of time scale of a prep, I think there are two different ways that essentially are accomplishing similar goals, which is to keep the deficit in a reasonable operating range. You know what I mean? So the two ways you could do that is take a longer prep than you would have, and then if you keep it linear, it's just a smaller deficit. You're allowed to take, you will give yourself the ability to take more kind of stepwise reductions that are less severe in magnitude. Like if you're going to do a 12-week prep, you got to dive right in and cut and cut and cut and cut. And there's just not a lot of opportunity to have a very modest deficit that gives you time to actually lose that weight in a reasonable time frame. And we know from research, there's several studies, some of which were actually done in very active populations. If you do a very rushed rate of weight loss versus a more slower approach, the rushed way of doing it is likely to have more unfavorable effects on your performance, your strength, and the amount of muscle mass that you retain from that diet. So in the interest of maintaining performance, strength, muscle mass, slower rates of weight loss with smaller relative deficits along the way are probably a good way to help with those aspects, but also to attenuate some of those short-term dictators of these adaptations, So long-term, you're still getting to the same body fat. Some of those more chronic dictators of these various feedback mechanisms are still going to be there, but the short-term stuff, the really rapid drops in calories, we can attenuate some of those effects, which is a nice thing. And so the reason I lump them together is I kind of see the kind of diet break approach as from a very big picture scale, a similar way of doing that. You're extending the timeline of the prep. So even if you're doing it in a nonlinear approach, over that month of dieting, you're generally keeping your deficit on average a little bit smaller than if you didn't implement the diet breaks or if you didn't extend your prep timeline. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. No, really nicely put. And the only thing I wanted to put towards you again in terms of kind of attenuating some of these things, and you rightly put, I think all of the listeners can agree with kind of that zombie mode you get into during prep where just everything is effort. And it's almost like, for me, the low energy levels at the end of prep are worse than any hunger you could kind of give me. I could take all the hunger just if I had some energy spare to actually kind of just do things like moving my arms around. And I don't know if there's anything you have come across as a coach. I don't know if there's anything in the literature either to attenuate any of those impacts on NEAT. As you rightly said, a lot of it is unconscious, I think. But I think there are some maybe conscious things we could do. Is there anything you've utilized?
Yeah. And before I answer that, I want to clarify. I talked about slow weight loss and then the kind of intermittent diet breaks as both being things that relatively reduce your deficit in the big picture. I don't want to act like I'm saying those are the exact same things. I think some of the acute hormone benefits of actually going to maintenance for a brief period are probably a little bit more advantageous. Right. So I don't want your listeners to come yell at me on social media. They're different, but kind of similar in what they're doing. Right. But your question was attenuating the drops in NEAT.
Yeah.
That's tough, and I'm glad you brought that up. So Eric Helms and I wrote an article about this quite a few years ago. It was probably like 3 or 4 years ago now. And I put in I was kind of being a smart ass, but I put in a line of like, well, just always fidget or something, or like, it was some stupid thing of like how to keep your NEAT up. And it was clearly very tongue in cheek. And I was just kind of acknowledging like there's certain things we just can't manage. And Eric was like, in the editing process, he was like, I really think we should take that out because I'm afraid people are going to take that literally and actually do it. But yeah, I was like, so there's certain things that we just can't deal with and maintain our sanity. So the little stuff, the way that you just move while you're sitting in your chair, that stuff we're just letting it go. I'm not going to tell you like, hey, keep one of those like little fidget spinners around and just always be messing with it, or try tapping your foot all the time, because realistically you're probably doing that less. But unless we want to absolutely drive you insane and burn you out psychologically, just let it go. Just let that stuff go. The things that you might be able to implement in a not ridiculous way. I know somebody that likes to keep their step count. They have like a Fitbit, or even like your phone might track it for you. But saying, okay, well, I should try to keep my step count generally at a certain operating range. And that way, if they've been an absolute like slug all day and just have not moved at all, that's something where they can say, okay, maybe I should take a walk because I'm clearly doing no non-exercise activity today. That would depend on the client. If I think that that's really going to mess with their head a lot and just keep them feeling like they're a hamster in a wheel that has to keep moving, I'm probably going to say, screw it. I'd rather add formal cardio, or I'd rather drop your calories more and just let you have the peace of mind of not worrying about it. But if you wanted to get very, very particular about it, something like keeping a step count up, or just trying to even more qualitatively be cognizant of the fact that you barely move anymore and trying to, it's little stuff. It's like when you're leaving your house to go to the office and you realize like, oh, I forgot my phone charger. but maybe my phone will survive and won't actually need a charge. When you're in prep, there's no chance you're going back to get that. When you're not in prep, you probably are going back to get that. Those are the types of things where you can just kind of be cognizant of like, maybe I should go grab my charger, you know? But I'm very hesitant to make like a blanket statement of like, make sure you adhere to your step counts, because I just don't want people to, I love bodybuilding, and the people I work with, I want them to love it too. I don't want it to be like a ball and chain that they kind of carry around, this huge burden that affects all aspects of their life. So that's kind of an individualized thing. It can be dealt with to some extent in those ways. The stuff that can't be dealt with, you just let it go.
No, I thought that was really well put, because step counts is something I utilized in my last prep, and it certainly got to a point where it was becoming a kind of all-encompassing, taking up my entire day. I'd have to go out for like a half an hour walk in the morning, middle of the day, at night. It was just becoming overwhelming, and I think you're completely right in that. Similar to kind of cardio, you kind of see diminishing effects of these sort of things. I even know my steps towards the end of prep were not the same as at the start, in that I didn't have the spring in my step. I was kind of dragging my heels. So it's kind of some of the things, and I think the way you put it in terms of you have to just accept it, let it go, don't stress about it. If calories have to come down, they're going to have to come down. I think that was really well put.
Can I mention a cool study on that note?
Definitely.
I believe we referenced it in the Metabolic Adaptation review paper, but Rosenbaum's lab out in Columbia did 2 studies looking at muscle efficiency after weight loss. And what's really cool, you mentioned like diminishing returns even when you kept your step count up. What they found in their lab was to do a fixed amount of work of cycling. After weight loss, the amount of calories spent on the same workload was less. You know, basically muscle efficiency was increased following that weight loss. But what I really love about their paper was they were like, well, wait a minute. Even though it's cycling, there's still a little difference in how much the legs weigh after you lose that weight, which like for something like walking is a big difference. The entire mass of your body is now different. But even with cycling, when you're sitting on a seat, they're like, technically, we should probably deal with the fact that your leg after weight loss that's doing the pedaling weighs less. And they actually did outfit the legs with they used DEXA to look at how much specifically leg mass was lost. And they actually replaced it with little tiny weights. Wow. And even in the context of weight replacement, the muscle efficiency was increased, meaning for the same amount of workload with the limb matched to weigh the same amount, less calories were spent. So that was not in your head. That's a thing that's been shown with some pretty cool studies.
And now you're going to get people wearing weighted vests going for their walks because we can attenuate for that.
I was going to say, back in the day, like the thing was people that like weren't that into fitness would still like put on ankle weights and wrist weights and like go walking. Oh yeah. So maybe now a bunch of bodybuilders are going to get ankle weights and take those on a stroll.
Eric, I want to say thank you very much for this podcast, because it's been really, really fun talking through this, and I think the audience are going to really enjoy it. And I want to make sure that if they want to find more about you, you've done a load of research papers, and you've got more on bodybuilders specifically that I want the audience to kind of go and check out. If they want to learn more about you, Eric, where should they head to?
So I'm on social media for like direct questions. Twitter is at Eric Trexler. Facebook is Eric Trexler. Instagram is at Trexler Fitness. I have like a ResearchGate page, and you can just search me on PubMed. The one thing I'd really like to bring attention to, now that I'm director of education at Stronger by Science, the article I'm working on right now is a 3-part article. It's going to be very long, very comprehensive, very detailed. And it's basically set up where I'm going to talk in part 1 about metabolic adaptation and go into more detail about some of the stuff we talked about today. Part 2 is going to be strategies to deal with it. So a more closer look at the evidence. Certainly diet breaks will be part of that, dealing with macros, managing your cardio. Part 3 is going to be what to do after the diet. Cool. So people talk a lot about reverse dieting, recovery dieting. So that's going to be a massive 3-part article. It'll come out in 3 installations over the next few weeks. It'll be totally free, and you'll be able to find it at strongerbyscience.com. So if I misspoke about anything today, hold me accountable based on the article, not what I said.
And that article, it may well already be out by the time this comes out. So I'll make sure if it is, we'll have it linked below so people can go and check it out as well.
Awesome.
Cheers, guys. And thank you again, Eric.
Thank you.